In the quiet of Briar County Cemetery, I laid daisies on my mother's grave when she appeared, her perfume sharp, her voice ice. "I told you to stay away," she hissed, before her fist met my cheekbone, all under the groundskeeper's unblinking security camera. Later, at the Northbridge Dynamics office, the printer jammed. Inside was a stack of her bank statements. She forgot that where I work, numbers don't lie. My name is Mara Quinn. I'm 32 years old, and today marks a decade since my mother was buried under the cold Grayfield soil of St. Vale Cemetery. The autumn wind had teeth. It bit at the exposed skin of my wrists and neck, a persistent, gnawing chill that the wool of my coat couldn't entirely defeat. It was a wind that carried the damp, earthy scent of decay, not of the dead, but of the season itself. Wet maple leaves, the color of rust and old blood, were plastered to the granite headstones, forming a slick, decaying skin over the names of the forgotten. The sky was a uniform, unforgiving slate gray, pressing down on the manicured lawns and weeping angels, promising a rain that never quite committed to falling. I knelt on the damp grass, my knees soaking through my jeans, and began the ritual. 10 years. It felt both like a lifetime and an instant. I pulled the dead, brittle stems of last season's flowers from the small vase built into the base of her headstone, my fingers numb and clumsy. The marble was cold, so cold it seemed to steal the warmth from my fingertips, a permanent chill that sunlight could never quite vanquish. Her name, Catherine Alida Quinn, was carved in elegant, simple script. Below it, the dates that bracketed a life cut short, and the simple epitaph we'd chosen. The song is ended, but the melody lingers on. I arranged the fresh bouquet of white daisies in the vase, their bright, innocent faces a stark rebellion against the muted landscape. They were her favorite. Simple, honest, unpretentious, everything Evelyn was not. The thought of my stepmother arrived unbidden, a sour taste at the back of my throat. It usually did, in this place. This was my one sanctuary, the only ground not yet ceded to her influence, and even here, her shadow fell long. A sharp click echoed on the wet asphalt path behind me. High heels. The sound was as out of place here as a scream in a library. I didn't have to turn around. I knew the sound, the unnaturally steady, percussive rhythm that announced her arrival everywhere. I knew the scent that followed, a cloying, expensive perfume that always smelled to me like wilting lilies and ambition. Evelyn Crane, chairwoman of the board of Northbridge Dynamics and the widow of my late father, came to a halt a few feet away. I felt her presence like a drop in barometric pressure. I remained kneeling, my back to her, my hand resting on the smooth, cold curve of my mother's headstone. "I thought I made it clear you weren't welcome here. Mara." Her voice was exactly as I remembered it from every boardroom and every strained holiday dinner. Low, controlled, and chilled to perfection, with an undercurrent of steel that could strip paint. Slowly, I rose to my feet, turning to face her. She stood under a severe black umbrella, though it wasn't raining, using it as a shield against the world. Her trench coat was immaculate, her hair coiled in a tight, severe bun that tolerated no stray strands. She wore dark leather gloves. She always wore gloves, as if she couldn't bear to touch the world with her bare skin. "This is my mother's grave, Evelyn. I'm always welcome here," I said, my voice quiet but firm. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, disturbed the placid mask of her face. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. She held it out, pinching it between her gloved thumb and forefinger. "This says otherwise, a legal restraining order. You are prohibited from entering the grounds of St. Vale Cemetery." I took the paper. The masthead was from a law firm I didn't recognize. The text was dense with legalese, and my name was misspelled. Mara Quinn, a small, deliberate insult. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "This is a forgery," I said, handing it back. "A bad one. You're losing your touch." Her eyes, the color of faded jade, narrowed. She took a step closer, lowering the umbrella slightly. The sharp, floral scent of her perfume intensified. "You don't belong here," she whispered, the sound barely disturbing the air between us. It was a statement of absolute conviction. "Just like you don't belong at the company. You're a relic of a past he was all too happy to forget." The insult to my father was the flint, but it was the desecration of this space, of my mother's memory, that provided the spark. I felt the heat rise in my own cheeks. The only thing he forgot was to read the fine print on the prenuptial agreement. That was it, the crack in the ice. For a single, fleeting second, the mask of controlled corporate power fell away, and I saw the raw, venomous creature beneath. Her lips thinned into a bloodless white line. The blow came without warning. It wasn't a slap. It was a punch, a closed fist, the hard bones of her knuckles connecting with the high point of my cheekbone with a sickening, wet thud. My head snapped to the side. A universe of white-hot stars exploded behind my eyes. The world tilted on its axis, the gray sky and the dark earth swapping places in a dizzying, nauseating swirl. A sharp, metallic taste flooded my mouth. Blood. The ringing in my ears was a high, keening shriek, drowning out the sound of the wind, her breathing, everything. My knees, suddenly devoid of strength, gave way, and I crumpled, landing hard in the cold, wet mud beside my mother's grave. Through the ringing, a new sound emerged, running footsteps on the path. A beam of light cut through the gloom, a bright, searching cone from a heavy-duty flashlight. "Hey, what's going on over there?" A man's voice, rough with concern. The groundskeeper. I pushed myself up onto one elbow, my head throbbing in time with my pulse. I could see him now, a large, burly figure in a work jacket, his flashlight pinned on us. As his light swept upwards, it caught a glint of something on the eave of the small stone chapel 50 yards away, a small, black dome, and in its center, a tiny, pulsing red light, the security camera. It was watching. It had seen everything. Evelyn took a single, panicked step back. Her composure, shattered for a moment, was instantly reassembled, but the cracks were visible. She raised her umbrella, angling it to hide her face from the groundskeeper, from the camera, from me. A black shield of plausible deniability. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking a swift, furious retreat on the asphalt. The only thing she left behind was her suffocating perfume, hanging in the cold, damp air like a ghost. The groundskeeper, a man named Sal I vaguely knew from years of visits, jogged over, his face a mask of worry. "Miss Quinn, are you all right? I saw... Did she hit you?" I tasted the blood in my mouth again and spat a small, dark rivulet onto the grass. "I'm fine. Sal, just slipped." The lie was automatic, a product of a lifetime spent managing Evelyn's public face, but the words felt wrong, tasted of ash. He looked from me to Evelyn's retreating form, his expression full of doubt, but he didn't press. "Let me help you up." He offered a hand, and I took it, my body feeling strangely disconnected and heavy. Back on my feet, a deep, throbbing ache began to radiate from my cheekbone. I pulled a tissue from my pocket and pressed it to my mouth, dabbing at my split lip. "You should report that," Sal said quietly, his gaze shifting toward the chapel roof. "The camera got the whole thing." "Thank you, Sal," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'll handle it." He nodded, gave me one last concerned look, and retreated, leaving me in the gathering dusk, alone again. I turned back to the grave. The white daisies were pristine, untouched. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and traced the cold, carved letters of my mother's name. The marble felt solid, real, an anchor in the spinning chaos. "Mom," I whispered to the stone, to the wind, to myself. "I've heard enough." For 10 years, I had tolerated Evelyn. I had played the game. I had worked my way up at Northbridge Dynamics on merit, enduring the whispers, the slights, the constant, unspoken war of attrition. I did it to protect my father's legacy, the company he built from nothing. But this was different. This was a line drawn not in the sand of a boardroom, but on the sacred ground of my mother's final resting place. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket, a low, insistent buzz against my hip. The sudden, electronic intrusion was jarring. I pulled it out. The screen glowed with the cold, impersonal light of a new email. Subject: Urgent. Final review for quarterly close. It was from the acting CFO, an automated calendar reminder, a summons to a different battlefield, one made of spreadsheets and projections, not headstones and fists, but I saw it now, with a clarity that was as sharp and painful as the ache in my face. They weren't different battlefields. They were one and the same, and the war had just gone hot. The lobby of the Northbridge Dynamics Tower in Midtown Grayfield was a cathedral built to the god of frictionless commerce. It was a cavern of glass, steel, and Italian marble that echoed with the soft, deferential clicks of expensive shoes. Sunlight, filtered through 30 stories of tinted windows, fell in sterile, geometric patterns across the polished floor. On the far wall, behind a reception desk that looked like a shard of a glacier, were the company's guiding words, rendered in 3-foot-tall brushed aluminum letters. Integrity accelerates logistics. I'd always found the sentiment amusing. Here, integrity was just another variable in the supply chain, a commodity to be managed. I pushed through the revolving glass doors, the throb in my cheek a dull, persistent metronome beneath a careful application of concealer. The makeup was thick, a spackle of corporate compliance over the ugly purple and yellow truth of Evelyn's fist. It was a good job, but not a perfect one. A faint shadow remained, a subtle asymmetry that only a discerning eye would catch. The receptionist, a young woman named Chloe whose smile was part of her uniform, looked up as I approached. Her eyes, professionally bright, flickered for a nanosecond to my cheek. The smile didn't falter, but it tightened at the edges. Then, her gaze slid away. Finding a point of intense interest on her computer monitor, she saw it, and then she officially unsaw it. This was the first rule of survival at Northbridge. You see nothing that isn't on a memo. It was a culture of weaponized silence, and Evelyn was its architect. "Good morning, Ms. Quinn," she said to her screen. "Morning, Chloe," I replied, my voice a little tight. I scanned my ID, and the gate slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Evelyn was my father's widow, the second wife who had outlived the founder and inherited the throne. I, on the other hand, had earned my place. I joined the company 5 years before he passed away, starting in analytics and clawing my way up to director of strategy. I knew the guts of this place, the shipping routes, the fuel cost hedging, the software that was our lifeblood, in a way she never could. She understood power. I understood the work. It was a fundamental, irreconcilable difference. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor was a silent ascent through the company's strata. The air was thick with the unseasonable tension that precedes an audit. The whispers had been circulating for weeks, passed in hushed tones over lukewarm coffee in the break rooms and via encrypted messages on company phones. Northbridge was in the final stages of a massive merger with Halberd Freight, a deal that would make us the undisputed titan of North American logistics. The due diligence was, therefore, forensic. Every expense, every contract, every decimal point was being scrutinized by armies of accountants. For most, it was a headache. For anyone with something to hide, it was a slow-motion nightmare. The doors opened onto the executive floor, a landscape of muted gray carpets, frosted glass walls, and the pervasive low hum of the building's HVAC system. My destination was the Aurora Conference Room, a name that promised a new dawn but usually delivered a slow death by PowerPoint. I was the last to arrive. The air in the room was stale, thick with the smell of burnt coffee from the carafe in the corner. Around the polished mahogany table sat the company's Praetorian Guard, the heads of operations, legal, and HR, all wearing the same expression of strained neutrality. At the head of the table, sat Victor Lyle, the interim chief financial officer. He was a man who seemed assembled from a kit of spare corporate parts, slicked back hair, a jaw that was perpetually tight with stress, and a wardrobe of impeccably tailored but soulless gray suits. He'd been a protege of Evelyn's for years, loyal as a hound. "Mara, glad you could make it," Victor said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He gestured to the empty seat opposite him. I sat, placing my leather-bound notebook and a pen on the table. The bruise on my cheek throbbed under the fluorescent lights. I could feel their eyes on me, the quick, stolen glances, the slight adjustments in their chairs. They saw it, too. And like Chloe downstairs, they would all choose to unsee it. Victor cleared his throat and tapped a button on the console, bringing the main screen to life. "All right, people, let's get started. As you know, the Halberd team is coming in for the final review next week, so we need to ensure our Q3 closes airtight. No surprises." What followed was the familiar, hypnotic ritual of corporate theater. Victor walked us through the preliminary numbers, his laser pointer a red slash across slides dense with charts and projections. He spoke in the smooth, empty dialect of the C-suite, a language of synergies, leveraging assets, and optimizing workflows. The department heads responded in kind, nodding at precisely the right intervals, their faces arranged in masks of thoughtful concentration. Questions were asked, but they were safe questions, designed not to elicit information but to demonstrate engagement. It was a dance, a carefully choreographed performance for an audience of no one. We were 30 minutes into this kabuki when Victor swiped to a slide showing a high-level summary of departmental project spending. It was a wall of numbers, meant to overwhelm, but I had spent the morning memorizing the appendices. My eyes found the line I was looking for, tucked away at the bottom, a footnote to a footnote. "Victor," I said, my voice cutting through the monotonous drone. The room went quiet. I didn't speak often in these meetings, but when I did, I made it count. "Could you go to Appendix D, subsection 7? A flicker of irritation crossed Victor's face, the annoyance of a conductor whose orchestra has missed a cue. He clicked through the presentation until the correct page appeared. It was a list of special project expenditures, coded with internal project names. "This line item here," I said, pointing my pen at the screen. "Project Plover. The expenditure is significant, nearly $3 million for the quarter, but there's no corresponding project charter or business case referenced. Can you provide a breakdown of those costs?" A palpable tension entered the room. The air, already stale, seemed to thicken. The other executives suddenly found the grain of the mahogany table fascinating. I was asking a real question. It was a violation of the unspoken rules. Victor's smile was a thin, brittle thing. He gave a small, condescending chuckle, the kind reserved for a child who has asked a naive question. "Mara, that's just a discretionary fund for client development and emergent operational needs. Standard practice." $3 million is a lot of discretion, I countered, keeping my tone even, inquisitive. "Given the Halberd scrutiny, shouldn't we have more detailed documentation? Just to be safe." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. He was no longer smiling. "It's been fully reviewed and signed off by the audit committee. It's an internal matter, handled at the board level. We don't need to get bogged down in the minutiae." He looked directly at me, his eyes cold and flat. "Don't go digging where you don't need to, Mara. That's what the committee is for." It was a warning, delivered with the sterile precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Stand down." The message was clear. Project Plover was off limits, Evelyn's territory. I held his gaze for a moment longer, letting the silence stretch. Then I gave a slight, acquiescent nod. "Understood. Just want to make sure all our bases are covered." I picked up my pen and made a note in my book. The others in the room visibly relaxed. The crisis had been averted. The dance could resume. But I wasn't writing about quarterly projections. I was writing a simple sentence, a reminder to myself. Those who fear the light fear simple questions. The meeting droned on for another hour, a slow march through meaningless metrics and action items that would be forgotten by lunchtime. I said nothing more, retreating into the role of silent observer. When Victor finally adjourned, I gathered my notebook and stood up, the ache in my cheek a loyal companion. As I walked back through the quiet, carpeted hallway toward my office, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It wasn't a call or an email, it was a text message, from a number I didn't recognize. There was no greeting, no sign-off, just 7 words. Check the printer on the 18th floor. Tracy, the 18th floor was a ghost town. Down here, in the windowless core of the building housing records and archiving, the 5 o'clock exodus was absolute. The vast open-plan office was a sea of identical gray cubicles, each a small, abandoned diorama of a life, a wilting desk plant, a coffee mug with a chipped rim, a photo of a smiling family taped to a monitor. The only sounds were the low hum of the servers from a locked room down the hall and the insistent, rhythmic beep of the industrial-grade multifunction printer. It sat in a dedicated alcove, a hulking beast of black and gray plastic the size of a small refrigerator. A single amber eye on its control panel blinked in a steady, accusatory rhythm. Error, paper jam, check all trays. My footsteps made no sound on the commercial-grade carpet. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of toner and dust. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. An anonymous text message was a flimsy thing to act on, a thread of smoke, but my instincts, honed by a decade of navigating the treacherous currents of this company, screamed that this was real. Victor's warning, Evelyn's fist, the throbbing bruise on my cheek. They were all points on a map leading me here. The machine was a Xerox Altalink C8070. I knew the model, a workhorse. I tapped the touchscreen, and the error message expanded, showing a diagram of the printer's guts with a flashing red icon over Tray C. Tray C was the high-capacity ledger paper feeder, rarely used. I gripped the handle. It was cool, smooth plastic. My breath hitched. For a second, I hesitated, a wave of cold dread washing over me. This was a boundary. Crossing it meant there was no going back. The image of my mother's headstone, slick with wet leaves, flashed in my mind. I pulled. The tray slid out with a low, heavy rumble. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't jammed with ledger paper. Lying skewed inside was a thick stack of documents, at least 30 pages, printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper. The top page was crisp, official. At the top, the discreet, powerful logo of a private bank, First Alden Trust. And below that, the account name, E. Crane Consulting LLC. My blood went cold. I lifted the stack out. The paper was heavy, expensive. This wasn't a copy. Someone had printed their private financial records directly to a network printer, an act of either supreme arrogance or catastrophic carelessness. I scanned the first page. It was a statement for the previous quarter. My eyes jumped to the transaction log. A pattern emerged almost immediately, a clear and damning rhythm, a series of large, incoming wire transfers from Northbridge Dynamics, coded as consulting fees, and then a series of outgoing payments, slightly smaller. On the days immediately preceding our major freight contract bids, the payments were funneled to 2 other LLCs, Norcrest Holdings and Apex Logistics Solutions, shell companies. I was certain of it. They were laundering the money, skimming it, and likely using it for bribes to secure the very contracts we were bidding on. This was the source of Project Plover. It wasn't a project. It was a slush fund, Evelyn's personal piggy bank, funded by the company my father built. My fingers trembled as I leafed through the pages. Then I saw it, on the margin of the 3rd page. Next to a staggering outgoing transfer of $2.8 million was a handwritten note. It was penned in a sharp, decisive script I recognized instantly from 1,000 signed memos. Evelyn's handwriting. The ink was a rich, dark blue, the kind that came from an expensive fountain pen. Plover escrow. Final disbursement 2.8 M. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered the arguments, the desperate phone calls, the pleas with my father to fund an experimental treatment for my mother. He had agreed. But Evelyn, Controlling the family finances even then, had insisted it was impossible, that his assets were tied up, that the market was too volatile, the number he had quoted, the cost of giving my mother a fighting chance, had been $2.8 million. A cold, precise rage, unlike anything I had ever felt, began to crystallize in my chest. It was sharp and clear, a perfect, terrible diamond of fury. Tucked near the back of the stack was a single, flimsy piece of thermal paper, almost lost between the heavy bank statements. It was a faded ATM receipt. The ink was ghost pale, but the details were still legible. A cash withdrawal of $5,000. The location of the ATM was a branch of First Alden Trust on Elm Street, 2 blocks from the Briarwood Hospice, where my mother had spent the last 6 weeks of her life. The date on the receipt was the day before she died. The image of Evelyn, wearing her leather gloves, her face a mask of false sympathy at the funeral, burned itself onto the back of my eyelids. My training took over, overriding the rage, channeling it into cold, methodical action. I pulled out my phone, one by one. I laid each page of the statement, plus the receipt, flat on the top of the printer. I used my phone's highest resolution setting, making sure the light was even, that there was no glare. The soft click of the digital shutter was the only sound in the silent room. Page after page, I photographed them all, my movements swift and precise. I opened a secure cloud application and created a new, triple encrypted folder. I named it Halo. I watched the small progress bar as each image uploaded, converting the paper trail into an indestructible digital ghost, evidence. Before replacing the documents, I tapped the printer's touchscreen again. Navigating to the job history log, the screen glowed with a list of recent print jobs. My eyes found it instantly. The job that had jammed the machine. The file name was Q3 ECT Private Final. It had been sent 30 minutes ago, and the originating user ID was logged clearly. B. Finch. Bethany Finch, Evelyn's executive assistant, a rookie, barely a year out of college. She must have sent the print job to the wrong printer. A simple, fatal human error. This was the first loose thread. Evelyn's carelessness in hiring an assistant, the assistant's carelessness in clicking a button, the first crack in the dam. A soft whirring sound from the end of the corridor made me freeze. The security camera, mounted on the ceiling, it panned on a slow, inexorable arc. It swept across the cubicle farm, its dark lens a soulless eye. In 5 seconds, it would have a clear view of me, of the bank statements spread across the printer. My body moved without thought, in a single fluid motion. I gathered the papers, squared them into a neat stack, and slid them back into tray C. I pushed the tray home. It clicked shut with a sound of finality. I turned my back to the alcove and leaned against the wall, pulling out my phone and pretending to scroll through emails, my posture casual, bored. The camera's lens swept past me and continued on its programmed path. I didn't breathe until it was facing the other way. My heart was still pounding, but the cold clarity remained. I had what I needed. But as I pushed myself off the wall to leave, my eyes caught something else. A thin sliver of white paper, a different kind of paper, was caught in the printer's output rollers, a casualty of the original jam. Carefully, I worked it free. It wasn't another bank statement. It was an internal expense report, printed on standard Northbridge letterhead. The heading read, Project Plover, Hospitality and Entertainment Q3. It was a list of expenses, dinners at 5-star restaurants, cases of vintage wine, client gifts that were clearly thinly veiled bribes. It was a ledger of pure corruption. I was about to fold it and put it in my pocket when I saw the last line item at the bottom of the page. It was handwritten, in the same blue fountain pen ink as the note on the bank statement. Victor Lyle's blocky, aggressive script this time, a new entry, added after the report was printed. Tonight, Briar Club, final confirmation. The Briar Club, an exclusive, old-money establishment where deals were made in cigar-smoke-filled back rooms, far from any prying eyes or recording devices. Final confirmation. They were closing the loop on something tonight. Something big. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It felt alien. Sharp. I looked up at the impassive lens of the security camera as it began its slow sweep back toward me. I let it see my face. I let it see the smile. "See you there," I whispered to the empty humming room. The trap was no longer theirs to set. It was mine. My office on the 23rd floor was my fortress. By 7 p.m., it was an island of light in a sea of darkness, the rest of the executive wing having long since emptied out. The city of Grayfield sprawled below my floor-to-ceiling window, a glittering, indifferent web of light. But I wasn't looking at the view. My attention was focused on the clean, white surface of the large magnetic whiteboard that dominated one wall. The rage from the archives had cooled, not dissipated, but sublimated into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Purpose. I was no longer a victim or a grieving daughter. I was an analyst. And the data set in front of me was the story of a crime. My job was to make it legible. I started with a simple diagram. 3 boxes drawn with a black dry erase marker. The first box I labeled Northbridge Dynamics. From it, I drew an arrow to the second box. E. Crane Consulting LLC. This was the front door, the supposedly legitimate channel for funneling company money directly into Evelyn's pocket under the guise of consulting. A classic self-dealing scheme, but sloppy. It was the next layer that showed the real intent. From Evelyn's LLC, I drew 2 more arrows, leading to a third box. This box represented the 2 shell companies I'd seen on the statements, Norcrest Holdings and Apex Logistics Solutions. This was the wash cycle. Money goes in dirty, gets tumbled around between anonymous corporate entities, and comes out looking clean. But corporations, even fake ones, leave footprints. A quick search on the state's public database of corporate records gave me Norcrest Holdings. It was a registered LLC, established 2 years ago. The address listed for its corporate headquarters was 1412 Miller Avenue. A quick search of that address brought up a storefront. Speedy Print and Ship. It was a mail drop, a ghost address in a strip mall. The legal representative listed on the incorporation documents was a man named Arthur Vance. The name was unfamiliar, so I ran it through an internal Northbridge HR database, cross-referencing it with payroll records. No hits. He wasn't an employee. On a hunch, I switched to the vendor payment system, and there he was, Arthur Vance, registered as an independent contractor for private transportation services. His home address, listed for tax purposes, was the same one Evelyn's personal driver used. It was her chauffeur. She had her driver set up a shell company to help her launder millions of dollars. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just corruption. It was contempt. She believed she was so far above scrutiny that she didn't even need to be clever. But the money didn't just sit in Norcrest. The bank statements showed that the funds, now laundered, were then transferred to a fourth entity, a nonprofit organization I hadn't noticed at first glance. I drew a 4th box on my whiteboard, labeling it the Plover Charity Fund. A charity. The cynicism was a physical blow. They were using the noble facade of a charitable fund as the final rinse cycle and, I suspected, as the distribution hub for the actual bribery. The statements showed that Plover Charity was making regular, large payments, listed as grants, for supply chain consulting services to smaller logistics firms, the very same firms that had mysteriously dropped out of major contract bids at the last minute, clearing the way for Northbridge to win. It was a complete, self-sustaining ecosystem of fraud. Then my eyes fell again on that single, handwritten note on the 3rd page of the statement. Plover Escrow. Final disbursement 2.8 M. The date of that transaction was October 14th, 10 years ago, the day my mother's last hope was extinguished. My hands moved automatically, my mind a cold, efficient machine. I logged into my personal cloud storage, navigating through years of archived files until I found the folder I was looking for. Mom's Start Medical. I opened a scanned PDF, a letter from the Mercy Oaks Foundation. the organization that managed grants for the experimental treatment she needed. The letter was dated October 14th. It was a formal, sterile rejection. We regret to inform you that due to a lack of immediate confirmation from your primary insurance provider, the grant for this treatment cycle has been allocated to the next candidate on the waiting list. Lack of confirmation, not denial. The insurance company hadn't said no. They had simply been slow to approve, and the grant was time-sensitive. I remembered the frantic calls, the endless hours on hold, the crushing weight of bureaucratic inertia. Next, I accessed my own archived Northbridge HR records. I pulled up my paid time off requests from that same month a decade ago. It was a painful calendar of desperation. October 5th, 2 hours PTO, personal matter. October 7th, 3 hours PTO, family emergency. October 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 12 separate entries, 12 blocks of time I had spent on the phone, begging, pleading with a rotating cast of insurance agents and hospital administrators, and for every call, I had first had to clear my absence with my father's office, which meant clearing it with his then executive assistant, Evelyn Crane. I remember her voice on the phone, a smooth, placid stream of condolences and obstacles. "He's in a meeting. Mara, I'll be sure to pass along the message. The underwriters are just very thorough. You have to be patient." She hadn't just watched me struggle. She had actively stalled, putting up the very walls of delay that made the insurance confirmation miss its deadline. She had manufactured the lack of confirmation. She had held the key to the $2.8 million and let the clock run out, all so she could divert the funds into her criminal enterprise. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a gunshot. Insurance hadn't denied the claim. Evelyn had. My mother didn't just die. She was, in a very real and calculated way, allowed to. I took a deep, shuddering breath, pushing the white-hot grief and rage back down. Emotion was a luxury. Vengeance required precision. I turned back to the data. I cross-referenced the dates of every major Northbridge contract win over the past 3 years with the withdrawal records from the Plover charity account. The pattern was as predictable as a tide table. Within 48 hours of every successful 9-figure bid, a large, round-numbered withdrawal was made. The cycle was almost exactly 90 days, matching the quarterly rhythm of the business world. This wasn't a slush fund for emergencies. It was a well-oiled operational part of Evelyn's business strategy. I looked at the hospitality expense report I'd pulled from the printer. Briar Club, private room, cash deposit required. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a payoff, a cash transaction in a soundproofed room, an exchange that would leave no paper trail. Finally, I logged into the company's enterprise resource planning system, the digital spine of Northbridge Dynamics. I ran a search for Project Plover. The system returned 0 results, no official project code, no budget allocation, no charter, no executive sponsor. As far as the company's official records were concerned, it didn't exist. It was a ghost. But I wasn't finished. I dug deeper, searching not for project codes, but for user-generated metadata tags. And there it was. The tag Plover had been attached to hundreds of internal expense reports, wire transfers, and invoices. It was a shadow filing system, and the digital record showed the tag had been created and was first used by one user ID, V. Lyle, Victor. He wasn't just aware of the scheme, he was its digital architect. I stood up and began to print. The bank statements from my Halo folder, the corporate registration for Norcrest Holdings, the address of the print shop, the public records showing Arthur Vance's address, the rejection letter from Mercy Oaks, my own PTO records from that terrible month. I pinned each document to the whiteboard. I taped the faded photograph of my mother I kept on my desk, a picture of her smiling in a garden, her face full of life, in the center of the board. Then, I took a spool of bright red thread from my desk drawer. I stretched one piece from the $2.8 million disbursement on the bank statement to the rejection letter from the hospital. I stretched another from Arthur Vance's name to the photo of Evelyn on the company's leadership page. another from Victor's ERP user ID to the Briar Club invoice. The board was a web of conspiracy, a constellation of greed and betrayal, with my mother's smiling face at its dead center. It was a declaration of war. They were meeting tonight at the Briar Club to finalize their next move, confident in the shadows of their private room. They had built a perfect stage for their crimes, hidden behind layers of corporate secrecy. They just didn't realize I was about to turn on the house lights. A war is not won with a single, decisive battle. It's won in the shadows, through logistics, intelligence, and the slow, careful cultivation of alliances. My whiteboard was a map of the enemy's territory. Now I needed to recruit my army. It would be a small army, and its soldiers wouldn't carry guns, but rather an encyclopedic knowledge of bylaws, access to server rooms, and a shared, quiet contempt for the Queen. My first target was Lena Petrova. Lena was the head of internal audit, a position that made her either the most powerful or the most powerless person in the company, depending on the day. She was a woman of fierce intelligence and even fiercer pragmatism, a career professional who had survived 3 different executive regimes by understanding that her job was not necessarily to find the truth, but to manage the official record of it. She navigated the treacherous political landscape of Northbridge with the grace of a trapeze artist, never making a move without knowing exactly where the net was. I invited her to lunch not at one of the sleek corporate bistros in Midtown, but at a tiny, cash-only soup and sandwich shop 3 blocks away, a place with mismatched chairs and condensation fogging the windows. It was a pocket of anonymity in the heart of the city, a place where no one from our world would ever think to look. We sat at a small, wobbly table in the back corner. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. After the waitress brought our bowls of lentil soup, I slid a plain manila envelope across the table. Lena looked at it, then at me, her dark, intelligent eyes wary. She didn't touch it. "What is this, Mara?" she asked, her voice low. "The reason the Halberd merger is going to fall apart unless we stop it," I said. She sighed, a long, weary exhalation that spoke of years spent dealing with departmental squabbles and inflated expense reports. She picked up her spoon. "If this is about Victor Lyle's expense accounts, I've already—" "It's not," I interrupted. "Look inside." With a reluctant frown, she opened the clasp and slid out the contents. It wasn't the entire dossier from my whiteboard. It was a carefully curated sample, just 2 pieces of paper. The first was a page from the Crane Consulting bank statement, showing a multi-million-dollar payment from Northbridge. The second was a schedule of the most recent freight contract bidding process, showing the date that our biggest competitor unexpectedly withdrew their bid. The wire transfer to a shell company from Evelyn's account was dated 24 hours before the competitor dropped out. It was a clean, simple, and utterly damning correlation. Lena stared at the papers, her face losing all its color. She put the documents down as if they were burning her fingers. She pushed the envelope back to my side of the table. "I haven't seen this," she said, her voice a tight whisper. "But you have, Lena." She shook her head, her gaze darting around the small, steamy restaurant. "No, I haven't, and neither have you. You need to burn this, now. Do you have any idea what you're holding?" "I know exactly what I'm holding," I said, my voice steady and cold. "It's a bomb, and the fuse is lit. The Halberd auditors are sharks. They'll smell the blood in the water. This will come out, with or without us. The only question is whether it comes out in a controlled demolition or an explosion that takes down the entire company." She looked at me, her expression a mixture of fear and fury. "Mara, you are pulling me into a hurricane." I leaned forward, my voice dropping even lower, forcing her to meet my gaze. "The hurricane is coming whether you open the door or not," I said. "Your internal audit, when this breaks, and it will break, the first question the SEC and the board are going to ask is, what did you know, and when did you know it? You can either be the one who was asleep at the wheel, or you can be the one who helped uncover it. Pick a side." I let the words hang in the air between us, thick as the steam from our soup. I saw the calculation in her eyes, the swift, pragmatic analysis of risk and reward. She was right. I had just made her an accessory, but I had also offered her the only viable path to survival. She slowly, deliberately, picked up her spoon again, but didn't eat. She just stared into her bowl. "What do you need?" she asked, without looking up. "Plausible deniability," I said. "For now." Back in the office, my second move was to secure the physical evidence. I sent a simple, polite email to Howard, one of the supervisors on the night security team. Howard was a quiet, Vietnam vet who'd worked at Northbridge for 20 years. I had made a point of knowing the names of the night staff, of treating them like people instead of fixtures. I once helped him navigate the company's labyrinthine HR system to get his pension paperwork sorted out. Loyalty, I had learned, was a currency far more valuable than cash. My email was brief. Howard, per protocol for anticipated litigation, legal requires a preservation copy of the CCTV footage from the 18th floor archive hall, camera 18C, from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. today. Please export the file to a secure drive and leave it in my confidential inter-office mail. Appreciate the help. Mara. The phrase anticipated litigation was a magical key. It allowed for certain procedural shortcuts, all under a cloak of legal necessity. It wasn't a lie, merely a prediction. Within the hour, a plain sealed envelope was in my mailbox. Inside was a thumb drive. I had the video. My third ally was Jonah, a sharp, perpetually stressed paralegal in our legal department. He was young, ambitious, and deeply disillusioned by the chasm between the law he'd studied and the corporate version of it he practiced. I caught him by the coffee machine. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, eyeing my face. "Just wrestling with the audit committee," I said, pouring myself a coffee I had no intention of drinking. Jonah snorted into his cup. "That's not a committee. It's an audience. Evelyn appoints the chair. The chair picks the members. They're a rubber stamp with a fancy title." "I know," I said, "but even a rubber stamp has to follow procedure. SEC regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley. There are questions they are legally required to answer if asked by an officer of the company, aren't there?" His eyes lit up with a flicker of interest. He was a creature of rules and regulations. This was his territory. "There are," he said, a small, conspiratorial smile playing on his lips. "They can lie. They can obstruct. But they have to answer. If you ask the right questions, in the right way, you can force them to create a record that can be subpoenaed." "Could you get me a list of those questions?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "I could do that." "One more thing," I said. "I'm compiling some sensitive due diligence materials for the Halberd merger. Victor wants everything kept on the main server, but I'm worried about data integrity. I need to create a secure, off-network repository, a virtual safe deposit box. Can you set that up?" He understood immediately. He wasn't just building a backup. He was building an arsenal, outside the control of Victor and Evelyn. "I'll create a new instance on our external counsel's cloud server," he said. "Triple encrypted, accessible only with a two-factor key that only you will have. We'll call it the Shadow Data Room." With my allies quietly in motion, I made my next move. I logged into the company's ethics and compliance portal, an anonymous reporting system managed by a third party. I filed a report. I laid out a vague but concerning fact pattern: potential irregularities in the accounting of a special projects fund, possible conflicts of interest involving senior executives, and improper documentation for certain consulting fees. I didn't name Evelyn or Victor. I didn't mention Crane Consulting. I was simply a concerned employee doing my corporate duty, but I was meticulous about one thing. I dated and timed my discovery of these irregularities to precisely 1 hour after my meeting with Victor. I was creating a clean, documented timeline. The moment I was warned off Project Plover was the moment my official concern began. I now had a time-stamped, legally protected position as an internal whistleblower. The final piece was the bait. I needed one more, undeniable link. I needed Victor's signature on a document directly related to Plover, written in his own hand. I drafted a one-page expedited expense authorization form. The vendor was listed as Briar Club Hospitality. The amount was $250,000. In the description field, I wrote, "Urgent requirement for pre-merger confidential hosting and entertainment for Halberd Freight key stakeholders. Per our discussion, Plover." The lie was elegant in its simplicity. It was urgent. It was tied to the all-important merger. And it referenced a non-existent discussion, a detail he would be too arrogant to question. I printed the form and walked to his office. His door was open. He was on the phone, barking orders about revenue projections. He looked up, annoyed at the intrusion. I placed the paper on his desk, my finger pointing to the signature line. "Victor, sorry to interrupt. Need your signature on this. It's for the Halberd dinner tonight," I said, my voice calm and professional. He gave the form a cursory glance, his eyes scanning the amount and the reference to Halberd. He saw the Plover tag and nodded, a look of understanding passing over his face. He thought I was finally playing ball, that I was now part of his inner circle. "Right, good," he grunted, reaching for his pen. It was a heavy, expensive-looking fountain pen with a silver cap. He unscrewed it, the movement practiced and smooth. He signed his name with a flourish. The ink flowed onto the page, a deep, rich, royal blue. It was the exact same shade of ink as the handwritten note on the bank statement. The same pressure, the same slight slant in the letters. It was a perfect match. He pushed the signed form back toward me without another look. The bait was taken. The trap was now set. The first move in a chess endgame is not to attack the king, but to control the board. The following morning, I sent a calendar invitation to the entire executive committee, including Evelyn and Victor. The subject line was innocuous. Mandatory pre-earnings call, briefing, Q3 risk and control review. The time was set for 10:00 a.m. The next day, it was a standard corporate meeting, a piece of bureaucratic camouflage they couldn't possibly refuse. But attached to the invitation was a single PDF document, prepared by Jonah. The file was named Standard Audit Control Queries. It was a dry technical list of 30 questions, each one a procedural landmine pulled directly from SEC and Sarbanes-Oxley compliance manuals. Questions like, "Please provide a full reconciliation for all non-budgeted special project funds exceeding $1 million," and "Can the committee attest that no corporate officers are beneficial owners of any consulting firms paid during this quarter?" To an innocent party, it was tedious boilerplate. To Evelyn and Victor, it would be a declaration of war. I had just placed my first pieces on the board, in plain sight. That night, under a moonless, starless sky, I drove back to Grayfield. I didn't go to the cemetery. I met Sal, the groundskeeper, in the parking lot of an all-night diner on the edge of town. The air was cold, and our breath plumed in front of us under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the diner's sign. He was a large, solid man, and his face was etched with a quiet gravity. He didn't ask questions. He simply passed me a small, padded envelope. "The lawyer fellow, Jonah, he sent over the paperwork this afternoon," Sal said, his voice a low rumble. "Said it was a preemptive civil subpoena. Sounded official enough for me." "Thank you, Sal," I said, my voice thick with a gratitude that went beyond the transaction. "You have no idea what this means." "I think I do. Miss Quinn," he said, meeting my eyes. I saw her face, some things. You just know. Inside the envelope was the thumb drive containing the unedited video file of Evelyn striking me. The cold, impartial eye of the camera was now my most credible witness. The second piece of the trap was more delicate. It required me to use their own corrupt infrastructure against them. From a burner email address I had set up, I sent a message to Bethany Finch, Evelyn's assistant. The sender's name was listed as Arthur Vance, and the email address was a generic one from a free provider, plausible for a man like her driver. The subject was, urgent, Plover package confirmation. The message was brief and written in the clipped, semi-literate style I imagined the driver would use. "Evelyn, Need to finalize the Plover consultancy package for the Halberd deal tonight. Set up the usual room at the Briar Club for 9 p.m. Need your final word on the cash allocation. Norcrest. Using the shell company's name was the key. It was a message from inside their own conspiracy. Within 20 minutes, Bethany replied to my burner account. CCing Victor. Confirmed. Briar Club. 9 p.m. The Chamberlain Room. I then called the Briar Club myself. I told the concierge I was confirming the audio-visual arrangements for the Chamberlain Room booking under Ms. Crane's name. The club, ever eager to please its high-paying clientele, offered a variety of services. Of course, the man on the phone said smoothly. The room is equipped with our standard conference package. Do you require the meeting transcription service to be activated? As you know, for client confidentiality, all recordings are made directly to a secure, encrypted digital file and provided only to the booking party. It was a standard feature, a legal service offered by the venue itself, agreed to in the fine print of every private room booking. It was designed for corporate depositions and sensitive negotiations, a way to have a perfect record. Yes, I said, my voice perfectly calm. Please have that service active. Ms. Crane will want a full record. At 9:15 p.m., Evelyn and Victor walked into the Chamberlain Room. I was parked across the street, watching the entrance, my laptop open on the passenger seat. At 9:45, a notification popped up on my screen from the Briar Club's secure server. Your audio file is now available for download. I downloaded the file. It was a high-fidelity recording. The first voice was Evelyn's, sharp, impatient, and utterly clear. Let's make this quick. No files, no paper trail, just the cash allocation. Halberd gets skittish if they see this kind of movement before the close. The next voice was Victor's. The usual split, 10% to Norcrest for the wash, 15% for the party favors, the rest stays in Plover until the vote. They had just dictated their own indictments. I immediately composed an email to Lena Petrova. I attached the audio file. The subject was, Confidential, Audit Committee, Eyes Only. The body of the email contained a single sentence. Lena, found this anomalous audio file attached to a Briar Club invoice during my Q3 review, labeling it Read Only for the audit trail until its relevance can be determined. I had just handed her a live grenade with the pin pulled. She was now a material witness with a documented, time-stamped piece of evidence in her possession. She couldn't delete it. She couldn't ignore it. She was anchored to my side of the fight. My next move was digital. Back in my office, I logged into the ERP system with my high-level administrator credentials. I navigated to the metadata tag control panel. I found the Plover tag that Victor had created. I didn't delete it. Instead, I activated a deep-level system function called Immutable Change Control. From that moment on, any transaction or file associated with that tag could not be deleted or altered without the system creating a permanent, unalterable log of the action, a log that recorded the user ID, the terminal, the exact time, and the nature of the change. I had just painted a target on every piece of their fraud and turned the system into a silent witness. I went home and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. I sat in the dark, watching the city lights, my mind a storm of calculations. At 2:20 a.m., my phone buzzed with a system alert I had set up. I opened my laptop. The alert was from the ERP. Someone had just attempted to alter records tagged with Plover. I logged in. The system log was pristine, clear, and damning. At 2:13 a.m., user ID V, Lyle had accessed 2 multi-million-dollar wire transfers to Norcrest Holdings. His action: delete transaction record. The system, functioning as designed, had blocked the deletion, but it had dutifully recorded the attempt. Victor, spooked by the audit questions or the meeting at the club, had tried to scrub the evidence in the dead of night, and he had failed. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the log. I used a piece of software to digitally sign and timestamp the image file, creating a verifiable, tamper-proof piece of evidence. I opened my browser, logged into the shadow data room Jonah had created, and uploaded the file. It joined the bank statements, the cemetery video, and the Briar Club audio file. The arsenal was complete. The next morning, as I was getting ready for the 10:15 meeting, an email arrived in my inbox. The sender was an anonymized, encrypted address. There was no subject. The body of the email was 6 words, a chilling echo of my visit to St. Vale. Stop now, or her grave gets dug. They were no longer just criminals. They were ghouls. The threat was meant to paralyze me with fear and grief, but it did the opposite. It incinerated the last vestiges of my restraint. They had mistaken my methodical planning for hesitation. They had mistaken my grief for weakness. I opened my email client. I composed a new message. I addressed it to the entire Northbridge Dynamics Executive Committee distribution list. I attached the anonymous, threatening email, and I wrote a single, cold, professional sentence above it. Oh, please be advised that due to a direct threat against my family in connection with the Q3 review, I am, effective immediately, activating the company's evidence preservation and whistleblower protection protocols. I look forward to our discussion at 10 a.m. I hit send. Across the company, on phones and on computer screens, my message would appear. They wouldn't know what evidence I had. They wouldn't know who my allies were. They wouldn't know what was coming. They would only know that one of their own had been threatened, and that a formal process had been triggered, a process from which there was no retreat. The door of the trap had just slammed shut. The sound was deafeningly silent. The Aurora conference room had been transformed. It was no longer a sterile chamber for corporate ritual. It was a television studio, a courtroom, a public stage. Bright, hot lights were mounted on tripods in the corners, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows. 2 robotic cameras, positioned for the quarterly investor webcast, hummed silently, their dark lenses aimed at the polished mahogany table. In the back, against the wall, sat a handful of reporters from the Grayfield Business Journal and the local news affiliate, their pens poised over notepads. My email had turned a routine briefing into a media event. The air was electric with anticipation, thick with the silence that precedes either a triumph or an execution. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, a portrait of regal composure. If my email had rattled her, she showed no sign. She was dressed in a severe dark blue suit, a string of pearls at her throat. She looked directly into the main camera, a practiced, confident smile on her face. Victor sat to her right, his own expression a poorly constructed mask of normalcy. The other board members fidgeted, avoiding eye contact with me, with Evelyn, with each other. They knew something was coming. The entire company knew. "Good morning," Evelyn began, her voice smooth as silk, broadcast to investors and employees across the country. "On behalf of the board and the entire Northbridge family, I want to welcome you to our 3rd quarter review. This has been a period of remarkable growth, driven by our unwavering commitment to our core principles." She paused, her smile widening. "Principles of integrity, transparency, and a deep sense of service to our communities. These are the values my late husband built this company on, and they are the values that guide every decision we make." The hypocrisy was so profound, it was almost sublime. She spoke the words with absolute conviction, a high priestess of a faith she had long since desecrated. She continued for another 5 minutes, a masterclass in corporate doublespeak. As she prepared to turn the presentation over to Victor, I raised my hand. "Madam Chairwoman," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the canned applause from her speech. Every head in the room snapped toward me. The robotic cameras swiveled, their lenses focusing on my face. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the reporters lean forward. Evelyn's smile tightened, a barely perceptible change, but her eyes went flat and cold, a predator's eyes. "Yes, Mara," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "Under the standing agenda item 4B, Risk and Mitigation, I have an urgent matter to bring to the committee's attention," I said. Her gaze swept over me like the edge of a knife. "This is a pre-earnings call. not a forum for operational minutiae. The matter is material to the company's financial reporting and our pending merger with Halberd Freight, I stated, using the precise language I knew she couldn't ignore on a live webcast. I believe it represents an existential risk that requires immediate disclosure and action from this board. Checkmate. She had no choice. To refuse would be an admission of wrongdoing on a recorded line. "The floor is yours, Ms. Quinn," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "Please be brief." "I will," I said. I stood and picked up the remote for the presentation screen. I did not look at her. I looked at the other members of the board, at the camera, at the truth. For the past several years, Northbridge has been funding a significant off-book liability codenamed Project Plover. I clicked the remote. The screen behind Evelyn, which had just shown a graph of soaring profits, was replaced by my simple, damning flowchart. 4 boxes, connected by bold, red arrows. Northbridge Dynamics. E. Crane Consulting, LLC. Norcrest Holdings. The Plover Charity Fund. A collective. Sharp intake of breath swept through the room. The diagram was stark, brutal, and easy to understand. It needed no explanation. It was the anatomy of a crime. This chart illustrates a flow of funds, totaling over $30 million in the last 3 years alone, from Northbridge, through a private consulting firm owned by our chairwoman, into a series of shell companies, and finally into a private charity controlled by Ms. Crane and Mr. Lyle. I let the image hang in the dead silent room for a full 10 seconds. Then I clicked the remote again. The flowchart vanished, replaced by an audio player. These funds were then used, among other things, for cash payoffs to secure business. I present a recording made last night at the Briar Club, legally captured as part of the venue's standard meeting transcription service. I pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the room, amplified by the conference speakers, crisp and clear. No files, no paper trail, just the cash allocation. A board member, a retired general who was usually half asleep, dropped his silver coffee spoon. It clattered against his ceramic saucer, the sound as loud and shocking as a gunshot in the silent room. Before the echo died, I clicked the remote again. The audio player was replaced by the screenshot of the ERP system log. When senior management became aware that these funds were under scrutiny, they attempted to erase the digital records in the middle of the night. I pointed my laser at the screen, the red dot hovering over the damning line. As the system log clearly shows, at 2:13 this morning, user ID V, Lyle attempted to illegally delete the primary transaction records. The system's change control protocols, which I activated, prevented the deletion but recorded the attempt. I turned my gaze to Victor. His face was the color of ash. A single bead of sweat traced a path from his hairline down his temple, a glistening tear of guilt. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were watching a replay of his own execution. I walked slowly to the table. I took the stack of bank statements I'd retrieved from the printer on the 18th floor and placed them deliberately in the center of the mahogany table. Here are the physical bank records for E. Crane Consulting, which I recovered from a company printer, that corroborate this entire scheme. Next to the statements, I placed a leather-bound copy of the Northbridge Dynamics Code of Conduct and Ethical Governance, and next to that, I placed the small, framed photograph of my mother from my office, her smiling face looking up at the ceiling. Evelyn finally broke her silence. "This is a personal vendetta," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "A fantasy concocted by a disgruntled employee." "Is it?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I clicked the remote one last time. The main screen held the ERP log, but a smaller, secondary screen beside it flickered to life. It showed the gray, rain-slicked grounds of a cemetery. It showed me, kneeling. It showed Evelyn, appearing behind me. "The evidence I have presented demonstrates a clear pattern of financial fraud," I said, my voice narrating the silent video. "But it also demonstrates a pattern of intimidation. This pattern became a direct, physical threat when I was assaulted at my mother's grave for asking questions. The silent video played on. The room watched Evelyn's lips move, saw my response, and then saw her gloved fist strike my face. A wave of audible gasps filled the room. The reporters in the back were writing furiously. "I am not showing you this video to elicit pity," I said, my voice hard as iron, as Evelyn's on-screen avatar turned and fled. "I am showing it to you as evidence of witness tampering and intimidation, directly linked to the anonymous email thread I received this morning, a threat to desecrate this very grave." I turned off the screens. The room was plunged back into the hot, bright glare of the webcast lights. I stood before the board, the silent photo of my mother the only thing I looked at. "According to SEC regulations and our own corporate bylaws," I concluded, my voice ringing in the profound silence, "the information presented here today constitutes a material event of gross misconduct, self-dealing, and fraud, which legally compels immediate and full public disclosure. Therefore, as an officer of this company, I formally move for the board to hold an immediate vote on the temporary suspension of Chairwoman Evelyn Crane and Acting CFO Victor Lyle, pending a full, independent investigation." For a long, stretched moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. The world seemed to hold its breath. The board members sat like stone figures, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and dawning comprehension. Then, it started, a single whispered conversation from the back of the room, another from the side. The whispers grew, merging into a low, incoherent murmur that spread across the room, growing louder and more frantic. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality shattering. It was the sound of a concrete floor, groaning under impossible stress, and then finally, irrevocably, beginning to crack. The chaotic murmur of the room was cut short by a new voice, calm and authoritative, slicing through the noise like a judge's gavel. "Kill the webcast feed, now." It was Marcus Thorne, the independent counsel for the Audit Committee, a man with a reputation for quiet ruthlessness and an unwavering allegiance to the letter of the law. He stood up, his face grim. "This meeting is now a closed, executive session of the board. All non-essential personnel and members of the press will vacate the premises immediately." The hot webcast lights were extinguished one by one, plunging the room into the cool, normal glow of its overhead fixtures. The reporters, grumbling but obedient to the voice of legal authority, were escorted out. The door clicked shut, sealing the remaining board members in a tomb of their own making. Thorne did not sit. "A motion has been put to the floor. The allegations are of a nature that requires an immediate response. We will now proceed to a vote." A palpable wave of fear rolled around the table. One of the older board members, a longtime crony of Evelyn's, started to bluster. "Now, let's not be hasty. Marcus, this is a complex accusation." "The accusation is fraud," a clear voice cut in. It was Eleanor Vance, a former university president and one of the two truly independent directors on the board. "The evidence is, at the very least, compelling enough to warrant the temporary suspensions. It is our fiduciary duty to act." "I agree," said General Miller, the retired officer whose coffee spoon had clattered to the floor. His hand, resting on the table, had a slight but visible tremor, but his voice was iron. "We are the guardians of this company. We cannot ignore this. We have to vote." Thorne nodded. A vote on the motion to suspend Evelyn Crane and Victor Lyle, pending an independent investigation, and to immediately report these findings to the relevant authorities. All in favor? Eleanor Vance's hand went up instantly. General Miller's followed a second later. After a heartbeat of tense silence, a third director, and then a fourth, raised their hands. They were the newer members, the ones without deep ties to the old regime. Finally, two more hands went up, reluctantly, their owners refusing to meet Evelyn's murderous gaze. "All opposed?" Thorne asked. Two hands were raised, Evelyn's two oldest allies. They were voting for their own survival, not hers. "The motion carries," Thorne announced into the dead air, his voice devoid of any emotion. 6-2. The suspensions are effective immediately. My office will make the necessary notifications to the SEC and the district attorney." The finality of his words hung in the air. It was done. As if summoned by the verdict, the conference room doors opened. 2 men in dark suits stood in the doorway, their badges identifying them as detectives from the Grayfield Police Department. The room was frozen. Victor Lyle seemed to shrink in his chair, his face slick with a sheen of cold sweat. The detectives walked past the table, their steps silent on the thick carpet. They didn't look at Evelyn. Their target was the numbers man. One of them stopped behind Victor's chair and spoke in a quiet, conversational tone. "Mr. Lyle, we'd like you to come with us to answer some questions." Victor didn't speak. He just made a small, wounded sound as they pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs being ratcheted shut was the only sound. As they led him out, the hallway erupted in a blinding storm of light. The reporters, waiting like wolves, had their story. The camera flashes strobed against the glass walls, a silent, frantic lightning storm. Evelyn stood up. She watched Victor being led away, her expression a blank mask of ice. She turned, and for a moment, I thought she might lunge at me. Instead, a strange, terrible smile stretched her lips. It was a rictus of defiance. Her eyes found mine, and they were filled with a hate so pure it was almost beautiful. Then, in a small, deliberate movement, I saw her left hand go to her right. Her fingers, trembling almost imperceptibly, twisted the massive diamond engagement ring my father had given her. She worked it off her finger, along with a diamond eternity band, and dropped them into the leather clutch on the table. It wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was the cold, pragmatic act of a woman moving her assets beyond the reach of forfeiture. The press swarmed as the meeting broke, their questions a chaotic roar. "Ms. Quinn, is it true Northbridge funds were used for bribes?" "Ms. Crane, do you have a statement?" "How long has this been going on?" Evelyn swept past them, silent and stone-faced, a phalanx of corporate security clearing her path. I followed a moment later. They turned their attention to me, microphones and cameras thrust in my face. I said nothing. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thin stack of papers. To each reporter, I handed a single document, a pristine copy of the Northbridge Dynamics Code of Conduct and Ethical Governance. I let the document speak for itself. While the drama played out in the lobby, the work continued in the back offices. Jonah, his face pale but determined, walked into the temporary headquarters of the external auditors. He placed a heavy accordion file and a single, encrypted hard drive on their conference table, the complete, unalterable contents of the shadow data room. I pictured the auditors, their sleeves rolled up, beginning the slow, methodical dissection of the fraud. The quiet rustle of paper like the flutter of birds' wings. The paper cuts had begun. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number, but I knew who it was from. A contact on the Halberd Freight negotiating team. The message was concise. "All merger discussions are suspended pending outcome of investigation. We commend the transparency of the process." It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a reprieve. I had saved the company from being sold to a partner based on a lie. A junior lawyer from Marcus Thorne's team found me by the elevators, holding a document on a clipboard. "Ms. Quinn," he said, his voice full of a nervous respect, "the legal hold. We need your signature to lock down all servers and user accounts." The document was titled, "Mandatory Preservation of Evidence Notice." It gave the IT department the authority to freeze everything, to prevent the digital destruction of any evidence. I took the pen he offered and signed my name on the line. I imagined the IT technicians in the cold server room, typing the commands that would digitally excise Evelyn Crane and Victor Lyle from the company they had bled. Their access codes, their emails, their entire corporate existence, erased with a keystroke. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Outside, the slate-gray sky had finally broken. A single drop of rain hit the glass in front of me. Then another, a quiet, steady rain began to fall, washing the grime from the air, streaking the windows, blurring the sharp edges of the city below. It was a gentle rain, soft and persistent, just like the one that had fallen at the cemetery. The adrenaline had long since burned away, leaving a hollow, echoing exhaustion in its place. Hours had passed since the boardroom ambush. The police, the press, the panicked board members, they had all dispersed, leaving behind a profound, unnatural silence on the executive floor. The company was a body in shock, its heart ripped out. The circulatory system of command and control momentarily seized. I was in the break room, a sterile space of stainless steel and formica, staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The victory, if that's what it was, didn't feel triumphant. It felt like the aftermath of a demolition, a field of rubble and dust where a condemned building once stood. Necessary, but grim. The door hissed open, and Lena Petrova walked in. She looked as exhausted as I felt. The day had taken its toll on her, forcing her out of her carefully constructed neutrality and into the line of fire. She said nothing. Simply walked to the industrial ice machine, scooped a handful of ice into a clean dish towel, and handed it to me. "For your face," she said quietly. I had forgotten about the bruise. It was a dull, throbbing ache now, a physical reminder of where this had all begun. I pressed the cold compress to my cheek, the sharp chill a welcome shock to my senses. "Thank you. The external auditors have been through Evelyn's office," she said, leaning against the counter. "They had a court order to open her personal safe." I nodded, saying nothing. It was just a formality now, a sweeping up of the last fragments of a shattered empire. "They found the usual," Lena continued, her voice flat. "Bearer bonds, a few pieces of undeclared jewelry, but they also found a file, a thin one, labeled Mercy Oaks." My heart, which I thought had settled into a slow, steady rhythm, gave a painful lurch. Mercy Oaks, the foundation that had denied my mother's grant. "It was correspondence," Lena said, her eyes watching my face carefully. "Letters from the foundation, confirmations of donations, thank you notes." She paused, taking a breath. There was a post-it note stuck to the top letter. It was in her handwriting. I waited, the ice melting against my skin, a slow trickle of cold water running down my neck. "It was a note to herself," Lena said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It detailed a matching donation pledge, a large one. The money came from the Plover Charity Fund, but the donation was contingent on one condition. I knew, even before she said the words, I knew with a certainty that was as cold and absolute as the grave itself. "The condition," Lena said, her voice full of a quiet horror, "was that the source of the matching funds, Northbridge Dynamics, was to remain completely anonymous and unacknowledged until the end of the fiscal quarter." The break room, with its humming refrigerator and fluorescent lights, seemed to fall away. The pieces, which I thought I had fully assembled, reconfigured themselves into a new, infinitely more monstrous picture, the $2.8 million. It wasn't just a number on a page, a sum diverted for a criminal scheme. Northbridge, through Plover, had actually allocated the money. The funds had been there. The grant was approved, contingent on the matching corporate donation. But Evelyn hadn't just stolen the money. That would have been a simple, comprehensible crime. She had done something far worse, by stipulating anonymity and a delay until the end of the quarter. She had deliberately gummed the gears of the bureaucracy. She had created the very lack of immediate confirmation that had caused the Mercy Oaks Foundation to reject my mother's application. She had weaponized the company's charity to create a fatal delay, all to keep the Plover Fund liquid for a few more weeks, to leverage it for a deal, to make it work for her. My mother's life hadn't been denied for the money. It had been used as collateral. Her survival was a variable in a cash flow equation, and it had been deemed expendable. My mother could have lived. She could have had the treatment. She could have had more time, more birthdays, more quiet afternoons. All of it traded away for a few percentage points on a quarterly report and a payoff at the Briar Club. The last thread of the web I had been so meticulously unraveling was not about greed. It was about something far darker, a casual, almost indifferent cruelty that was somehow more chilling than pure malice. I sat there, in the silent, empty break room. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out two things: the faded, flimsy ATM receipt from the branch near the hospice, a record of Evelyn's petty cash needs while my mother lay dying nearby, and the photograph of my mother, smiling in her garden. I placed them side by side on the table. For the first time all day, I noticed that my hands were perfectly, unnaturally still. The trembling was gone. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a vast, cold emptiness. Lena watched me, her face a mask of sorrow and pity. "You won, Mara," she said softly. "You actually won." I looked up from the photograph, my gaze meeting hers. A slow, sad smile touched my lips, a smile that held no warmth, no joy. "No," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "I just pulled the last thread." My phone buzzed on the table, a stark, electronic sound in the stillness. It was a text message from a number I recognized as Sal's, the groundskeeper. I put a new bunch of daisies on her grave, no charge. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in my eyes, blurring the harsh fluorescent lights. It was the first time I had cried all day. It wasn't a cry of grief or anger, but of a strange, painful gratitude for a simple act of human kindness in a world that had shown me so little of it. I typed back a short reply, my fingers moving with a newfound steadiness. "Thank you." Today she heard the truth. I wiped the tears from my eyes with the back of my hand. The door hissed open again. This time it was the young lawyer from Marcus Thorne's team. His face was serious, his eyes holding a new deference. "Ms. Quinn," he said respectfully, "the board has concluded its private session. They've reached a final decision. They've sent me to ask if you would please come back to the Aurora room." The walk back to the Aurora room was like moving through water. The air on the executive floor was thick with a new kind of silence, not the productive quiet of a workday, but the stunned, hollow silence of a battlefield after the guns have stopped firing. People, the few assistants and junior executives still remaining, averted their gazes as I passed. They did not look at me with fear or admiration, but with a kind of awe, as if I were a natural disaster they had just survived. When I entered the room, the scene was reset. The debris of the initial confrontation, the scattered papers, the overturned coffee cup, had been cleared. The board members were back in their seats, arranged around the table like figures in a wax museum. Evelyn was not among them. The seat at the head of the table was empty. Eleanor Vance, the former university president, now sat in the chair to its right, a position of temporary authority. Marcus Thorne stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. There was no preamble. There were no pleasantries. The time for corporate theater was over. Eleanor looked down at a single sheet of paper in front of her, her expression unreadable. She spoke, and her voice was the clear, dispassionate instrument of the board's will. "The board has met in executive session," she began, her words precise and stripped of all emotion. "Pursuant to the powers vested in us by the corporate charter and in light of the evidence presented, we have voted on 2 resolutions." She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. The room was utterly still. I could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the room's electronics. Resolution 1. Effective immediately. The board has terminated the employment of Mr. Victor Lyle for cause, on the grounds of gross financial misconduct and conspiracy to commit fraud. It was a statement of fact, delivered like a line item in an inventory. Resolution 2, she continued, her eyes still fixed on the paper. Effective immediately. Ms. Evelyn Crane is removed from her position as chairwoman of the board and is dismissed from this company. All titles, benefits, and responsibilities are hereby revoked. Dismissed, not suspended, not asked to resign. The word was brutal. A corporate execution. Eleanor Vance looked up from the paper for the first time, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the other directors before finally landing on me. There was no warmth in her eyes, no congratulation. There was only the grim acknowledgement of a necessary, but deeply unpleasant, task completed. "The board," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "also wishes to extend its formal gratitude to the internal whistleblower for bringing these grave matters to our attention. Your courage is noted." That was it. A single, sterile sentence. There was no applause. No one stood up. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, weighted with the raw metal of broken careers, shattered legacies, and the uncertain future of the company we had all just torn apart. Your courage is noted. It was the corporate equivalent of a Purple Heart, a small token acknowledging a wound taken in service to a cause no one really wanted to fight for. I gave a single, slight nod. I did not say thank you. There was nothing to be thankful for. I stood up, my chair making a soft scraping sound on the floor. My movements felt slow, deliberate. I walked to the table where the evidence I had presented still lay. I picked up the thick stack of bank statements from Crane Consulting LLC. They felt heavy in my hand, thick with the weight of their secrets. I folded the stack in half. The heavy bond paper resisted for a moment, then gave way with a sharp, cracking sound, as loud as a breaking bone in the silent room. I turned and walked toward the door, the folded papers in my hand. She was waiting in the corridor, flanked by 2 corporate security guards who looked deeply uncomfortable. Evelyn. She was not being escorted out. She was merely being contained, her presence a toxic asset that needed to be managed until it could be removed from the building. She had her leather clutch in her hand, but her face was stripped bare of its usual mask of authority. It was pale, drawn, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes besides contempt or rage. I saw the abyss, the terrifying, bottomless void of a queen who has lost her throne and has no other world to rule. I slowed my pace as I approached, stopping half a beat before I was past her. She looked at the wall over my shoulder, refusing to meet my eyes. I could smell her perfume, the same sharp, floral scent from the cemetery, but it seemed weaker now, a ghost of its former power. Her hands, clasped in front of her, were bare. The naked indentations where her rings had been for so many years were like pale, fresh scars. I leaned in slightly, my voice no more than a whisper, a private message intended only for her, the final entry in a long and terrible ledger. "The numbers are done talking." I saw a flicker in her jaw, a muscle clenching and unclenching. It was the only sign that she had heard me. I walked on without looking back, leaving her to the silence and the security guards. The elevator ride down was silent. I was alone. I watched the floor numbers descend, a countdown to a new reality. When the doors opened into the grand marble lobby, it was to a different world than the one I had entered that morning. The tension was gone. The air felt lighter. Through the massive glass doors at the front of the building, I could see that the rain had stopped. I pushed through the revolving door and stepped out onto the wet pavement. The air was clean, washed, smelling of damp concrete and the promise of a clear night. Above the towering canyons of Midtown, the thick gray cloud cover had broken, and a single, improbable patch of pale blue sky was visible, the color of hope, or perhaps just the color of a bruise beginning to heal. I took out my phone. My thumb moved over the screen. My movements sure and steady. I brought up my messages and found my brief conversation with Sal, the groundskeeper. I typed a new message. "I'll be there tomorrow to clean the grave." I hit send. The small delivered notification appeared beneath it, a promise made, a duty to be fulfilled. My phone immediately buzzed again in my hand. The caller ID was the head of Northbridge's PR department, an invitation, no doubt, to be the triumphant face of the new, reformed company, a press conference, a chance to tell my story, to be the hero. I looked at the ringing phone, at the name on the screen. Then I pressed the red button, declining the call and silencing the ringer. There was nothing more to say. My story had already been told. Not in words, but in numbers, in documents, in the cold, hard facts that had brought an empire to its knees. My final stop was not my office. It was the records department on the 18th floor, the place where the last act had truly begun. The room was empty, just as it had been before, the only sound the low, steady hum of the building's life support. I walked to the far wall, where a row of heavy-duty office machines stood sentinel. I stopped in front of a large industrial document shredder. A small placard on its front read, "Completed Projects." I stood before it for a moment. I looked down at the thick, folded stack of bank statements in my hand, the paper that had started it all, the ghost from the machine. I could have kept it as a trophy, a souvenir of my victory. But the victory was not the point. The point was the truth, and the truth had now been served. I held the stack over the shredder's intake slot. A small, steady red light glowed on its control panel, indicating it was ready. I let the papers go. The machine whirred to life, its steel teeth grabbing the documents and pulling them in with a greedy, grinding hunger. The sound was a low, satisfying growl. The sound of secrets being unwritten, of a crime being rendered into meaningless, harmless confetti. I watched until the last corner of the last page disappeared into its maw. The grinding stopped, the machine went silent, and the small red light on its control panel turned to a soft, steady green. Completed. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And if you'd like to support us further, hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners.